April 17th, 1943, 23,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. The sky trembled with the roar of engines and the cutting chatter of machine guns. Contrails twisted like white scars against the deep blue, tracing the chaos of war in the upper atmosphere. Below, the black smog of flak bursts blossomed like malignant flowers, dotting the sky around a formation of American bombers, the consolidated B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force. Inside one of them, a weathered B-24D nicknamed Miss Marjorie. The crew fought to keep their bird in formation. Sergeant Will Tex Morgan sat hunched inside the ball turret, his knees pressed against cold steel, eyes fixed on the approaching dots in the distance. Luftwaffe fighters, dozens of them. FW-190s, sleek and fast, diving from above. Bandits 11 o'clock high, came the shout over the intercom. The pilot, Captain Robert Haynes, clenched his jaw. He could see the flashes, the sun glinting off the German fighters' canopies as they swooped in. Then the first tracer streaked by, and the whole formation erupted in gunfire. Morgan twisted his twin .50 caliber Brownings and squeezed the triggers. The air shook as the guns spat flame, their rhythmic hammering echoing through the aircraft's fuselage. Empty brass casings clattered around his boots. Every vibration, every sound, became part of the same mechanical symphony of survival. The Luftwaffe pilots had seen B-17s before, tough, steady, dangerous, but this was different. The B-24 had a leaner body, longer wings, and an odd shape that made it tricky to predict. What caught their attention most wasn't its shape or altitude. It was the sheer number of guns flashing back at them. Every angle of approach seemed suicidal. Verdammt! They're covered in guns! One German pilot, Oberleutnant Karl Voss of JG-1, shouted as his FW-190 peeled off to avoid a curtain of .50 caliber fire. His wingman wasn't as lucky. His left wing shredded by a burst from Miss Marjorie's top turret. The fighter spun into smoke and flame, vanishing below the clouds. From his cramped seat, Tex Morgan felt a strange satisfaction between bursts. He didn't know it yet, but this single engagement, this rain of bullets and twisted metal, would spark deep curiosity in the minds of the Luftwaffe's engineers. When Miss Marjorie limped back to England, the men aboard were too exhausted to think. They didn't know that one of her sisters, a B-24 from the same formation, hadn't made it. It had gone down somewhere near Emden, torn apart mid-air. 2 days later, on the muddy outskirts of Emden, a group of Luftwaffe recovery officers and engineers gathered around the twisted wreckage of that fallen B-24. Among them was Hauptmann Erich Müller, a meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for technical obsession. He wasn't there to gloat over the kill. He was there to understand it. As the fog rolled in from the North Sea, Miller stepped toward a battered spherical object resting amid the debris. It looked alien. A steel bubble with shattered glass panels and twin barrels pointing outward like defiant fangs. "The ball turret. Bring it into the hangar," he ordered quietly. "I want this." Thing opened. The recovery crew nodded. They had pulled engines, wings, even whole fuselages before, but never something like this. The turret was intact enough to study, its mechanisms jammed but its structure whole. As the soldiers loaded it onto a flatbed, Miller couldn't take his eyes off it. He already suspected this strange American design might reveal something critical about why the Luftwaffe's attacks were costing so many pilots. He didn't know it yet, but inside that steel sphere lay more than machinery. It held a philosophy of war unlike anything Germany had built. Back at the Luftwaffe Test Center in Rechlin, technicians prepared the turret for inspection. The engineers would soon take it apart, screw by screw, cable by cable, and what they would discover inside would leave them stunned, questioning whether any aircraft should ever carry that much concentrated firepower again. For now, the airfield echoed only with the hiss of acetylene torches and the creak of a winch lifting the turret onto the workbench. Miller watched in silence, his notebook already open, ready to record everything. He had seen hundreds of Allied designs, but something told him this one would be different. The engineers at Rechlin had worked on captured Spitfires, P-38s, even a few flying fortresses, but none of those had prepared them for this strange, menacing steel bubble now sitting under the hangar lights. The B-24's Sperry ball turret looked more like a weaponized escape pod than a defensive system. Its glass panels were cracked, its guns bent from impact. But the interior was nearly intact, a mechanical labyrinth of levers, gears, and hydraulic pistons. Hauptmann Erich Miller adjusted his spectacles, leaning closer as a technician unscrewed the warped access panel. "Careful," he muttered. "Document every step." The smell of burnt oil and aviation fuel clung to the metal, and somewhere beneath that was the faint, sharp scent of cordite. With a hiss, the last bolts came free, and the engineers pried open the hatch. What they found inside made them pause. The space was impossibly small, no wider than a kitchen chair, and clearly designed for a man to be folded inside like a contortionist. 250 caliber Browning machine guns jutted from the front, their belts feeding from ammunition boxes mounted just outside. Hydraulic lines snaked through the frame like veins, connecting the foot pedals, hand controls, and electric motors that allowed the gunner to rotate the sphere in all directions. "Mein Gott," whispered one of the younger engineers. "How could a man even fit in there?" Mueller's pencil scratched against his notebook. Compact, electrically powered rotation, twin heavy machine guns, no armor beyond curvature of glass and steel. Designed for maximum field of fire. He crouched, peering through the shattered glass at the gun's arc of motion. The design was brilliant in its simplicity. Nearly 360 degrees of firing range, allowing the gunner to strike from below, a blind spot for most German attacks. This explained much of what their pilots had been reporting. "Sir," said Lieutenant Hans Kramer, his assistant, "our fighters cannot approach from below without being shredded." "Perhaps this is the reason for those recent losses." Miller nodded slowly. "Yes, they've built a fortress that bites from every angle. Even the underside. They powered up the turret's rotation motor using a converted voltage adapter. With a hum, the mechanism came alive, turning smoothly despite the damage. The sphere rotated, its twin barrels tracking invisible targets around the hangar. The sound was eerie, mechanical precision infused with menace. But what fascinated Miller wasn't just the engineering. It was the philosophy behind it. The Americans, he realized, weren't designing for speed or elegance. They were designing for survival through overwhelming firepower. Every angle of a B-24 bristled with guns, 10 or more in total, manned by crew members trained to defend every direction. Front, tail, top, sides, and now even beneath. Each turret was a miniature fortress, and together they created a sphere of death around the aircraft. He motioned to the chalkboard beside the workbench. Kramer drew a rough outline of a B-24, marking the locations of each gun. Dorsal, ventral, nose, tail, and waist positions. This is absurd," Kramer said, stepping back. "That's nearly 10 heavy guns on one aircraft." 10? Miller echoed, his expression unreadable. "Try 12. Including the chin modification. 12 50 caliber machine guns, nearly the armament of an entire anti-aircraft platoon, mounted on a single flying platform." The engineers exchanged glances. They knew what that meant. For years, the Luftwaffe had prided itself on speed, maneuverability, and precision. Their doctrine revolved around striking first and fast, the elegant kill. But the Americans were fighting a different war altogether, one of endurance, attrition, and sheer industrial might. The B-24 wasn't built to dance. It was built to endure a storm and answer it with thunder. Miller tapped his pencil against the turret's glass. "It's a weapon of fear," he said quietly. "Not just for the enemy, but for the man inside as well. Imagine being trapped in this. No escape if the hydraulics fail, no way out if the plane burns. Only your guns, your training, and hope that you live to land." As if on cue, a mechanic handed him a small object recovered from the wreckage, a flight manual page, half-burned, written in English. Miller squinted at the smudged type, part of the turret's emergency procedure. It described the process to manually crank the turret upright before exiting. He let out a low whistle. By hand, he murmured. At altitude, under fire. They've made courage a requirement of the design. That night, as the engineers filed their reports, Miller stayed behind, staring at the gutted B-24 turret under the dim lights. He thought about the man who'd once been sealed inside it, spinning in circles while the world outside burned. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the brilliance of the machine, or the madness it demanded from the men who used it. And yet, deep down, he knew what this meant for the Luftwaffe. If these bombers could blanket the sky with so much gunfire, no lone fighter could bring them down anymore. Attacks would have to be faster, more coordinated, more reckless. As dawn broke, Miller closed his notebook and looked at the turret one last time. It's not just an aircraft, he whispered. It's a flying fortress in spirit, even if it's not a B-17. He didn't know it yet. But soon those very words would echo through Luftwaffe command, as new tactics were drawn up, and desperate countermeasures began. The next morning, the findings from Hauptmann Müller's inspection arrived at Luftwaffe High Command. The report was marked Technische Bewertung, Geheim, Technical Evaluation, Classified. Inside were dozens of hand-drawn diagrams, mechanical analyses, and one unnerving conclusion. The B-24 Liberators defensive system exceeds all expectations. Every angle of approach faces sustained heavy fire. Single-engine interceptors are at extreme risk. At Rechlin Air Base, a meeting was called. Inside the concrete operations hall, a dozen senior officers and engineers gathered around the mangled remains of the B-24 turret, now placed under a large canvas sheet. Smoke from cigars coiled toward the ceiling as men spoke in clipped tones. The kind of conversation that carried both disbelief and frustration. Colonel Dieter Heidkamp, head of Luftwaffe aircraft evaluation, stepped forward and peeled the cover off the turret. Gentlemen, he began, this is what our pilots have been fighting against for months. The Americans have created a defensive sphere of fire. He gestured to the glass dome. 250 caliber guns hydraulically stabilized. Below, where no German pilot expects resistance. Oberst Hermann Volter, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, leaned in close, hands on his hips. And how many of these are on one aircraft? 12, Miller said from the back of the room. He stepped forward, holding his notebook. 12 heavy machine guns manned by 10 crew, each with interlocking fields of fire. The result? No safe angle of attack. The room fell silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. Absurd, Walter said at last, shaking his head. No aircraft should carry that much weight in guns and ammunition. It's inefficient. It's American. Yes, Miller replied calmly, but it works. He flipped open his notes to a diagram showing the arcs of coverage. Every segment of the bomber's perimeter was shaded, overlapping like scales. If our fighters approach from above, the dorsal turret engages. From the rear, twin-tail guns. From below, the spherical weapon fires. Even the nose is covered. Their crews can defend themselves in all directions at once. Heidkamp exhaled slowly. So that explains the mounting casualties. Every mission we lose more pilots to defensive fire than to escorts. The engineers murmured among themselves. They had studied countless Allied aircraft, but never one that weaponized its entire body so thoroughly. For the Luftwaffe, whose doctrine prized elegance, the perfect strike, this was an alien kind of warfare. It wasn't beauty. It was brute survival. What's the practical range of these guns? Walter asked. Effective range, roughly 600 meters, Muller replied. But multiply that by 12. At any given moment, a formation of 10 B-24s can lay down a continuous wall of bullets stretching hundreds of meters across the sky. Our Focke-Wulfs cannot survive that without coordination. One of the young engineers, Lieutenant Kramer, cleared his throat. Sir, this design shows the Americans' intent. They don't trust maneuver. They trust firepower. Their entire strategy depends on reaching the target, not outmaneuvering us. Heidkamp gave a grim nod. So, gentlemen, we must adapt. A large map of the Western Front was unrolled on the table. Thin black lines traced the usual flight paths of American bombers, from East Anglia to the Ruhr, Bremen, and Hamburg. Red dots marked Luftwaffe interception zones, Miller pointed with his pencil. If single fighters cannot pierce their formation, then we strike with packs, head-on, at high closure speed. The frontal arc is thinner than the sides or rear. It's the only gap in their defense. Walter frowned. Head-on, that's suicide, perhaps, Miller admitted. But it's the only chance to overwhelm their gunners before the escorts arrive. The idea was daring and deadly. But within weeks, it would evolve into one of the Luftwaffe's most infamous tactics, Sturmböcke attacks, heavily armored FW-190s making frontal assaults against bomber formations. Still, even as plans were drafted, many couldn't shake the disbelief. It makes no sense, Walter muttered. Why build something so heavy, so slow, so burdened with guns? It shouldn't fly? Perhaps not, Miller replied. But the Americans aren't building airplanes. They're building machines that make killing them too costly to try. The words hung in the air. Outside the hangar, a row of captured B-24 wreckage shimmered under the cold German sun. Mechanics worked in silence, their faces smudged with oil and soot, their hands tracing foreign metal. Later that evening, Miller walked alone through the hangar, past the turret they had dismantled. Its twin barrels still pointed outward, silent but defiant. He placed a hand on the cool steel and imagined the gunner who once sat inside, spinning, firing, and praying as enemy tracers sliced past his canopy. He wrote one last note in his journal before leaving for the night. The Americans have turned fear into design. Their turrets are not just weapons. They are shields of the human will, forged in steel and madness alike. By the time his report reached Berlin, orders had already gone out. Fighter groups across occupied Europe were to change tactics immediately. The skies over Germany were about to become even deadlier. Summer 1943. The new Luftwaffe directives were in motion. Across France, Holland, and northern Germany, fighter groups trained in new formation tactics, massed head-on attacks meant to break the American bomber streams before their defensive guns could react. It was a brutal gamble, conceived out of desperation and fear. The test of those new tactics came on August 17, 1943, the day of the famous Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid. 760 American bombers roared toward southern Germany in two great columns, their silver wings glittering in the early light. From the ground, they looked like migrating geese. From above, they looked like an armada of fortresses. At Rechlin, Hauptmann Erich Miller stood on the flight line beside a group of officers as news came crackling through the radio. First contact over Aachen, then heavy resistance over Kassel. Fighter wings from JG-1 and JG-11 were already climbing. The sky to the east was a pale gray sea, but soon it would boil black with smoke. He listened to the transmissions with a knot in his chest. The voices of pilots he had briefed himself were shouting over static, engaging the front of the formation, closing range. Got, they're firing already. Too many. Break, break! The first attack runs met a storm of gunfire. The B-24s, lumbering but steady, opened up with every turret they had. Each bomber became a spinning thunderhead, spitting hundreds of rounds per minute. The air between them glowed with tracer lines. German fighters dove through that fire at nearly 500 kilometers an hour, their armored windshields cracking from impacts, engines coughing from hits. One pilot, Oberfeldwebel Karl Voss, the same man who months earlier had cursed the Liberators' guns over Bremen, now found himself diving straight into their wall of lead. His FW-190 shuddered violently, rounds hammering his wings and fuselage. He squeezed the trigger anyway, sending a burst of 20mm cannon shells into the lead bomber's nose before veering hard right. His canopy exploded outward, and the last thing he saw was the great silver belly of a Liberator tumbling past, its guns still blazing. Minutes later, Voss's voice went silent. From his desk at Rechlin, Miller gripped the edge of the table as reports poured in. Dozens of German fighters destroyed, many more damaged. American losses were severe too, bombers dropping out of formation, spiraling earthward like burning comets. But still, the formation pushed on. It never broke. He knew what that meant. The Americans had succeeded. Their philosophy, firepower over agility, survivability over speed, was paying off. Each B-24 carried enough guns to defend not only itself, but its neighbors. Together, they formed a self-sustaining storm. Hours later, the surviving German pilots staggered back to their airfields. The smell of burnt oil and sweat clung to them as they climbed from their cockpits. Mechanics counted bullet holes, dozens, sometimes hundreds, peppering each surviving aircraft. Many landed with no ammunition left at all. When Muller met them, they said the same thing every time. We couldn't get close. Every direction was death. He led one of the pilots, still shaking, into the hangar. The captured B-24 turret was still there, mounted on its testing rig. Miller gestured toward it. "This," he said quietly, "is what you faced. The heart of their defense." The pilot stared at the cold steel sphere, eyes wide. "We thought the gunners were machines," he said hoarsely. "No man could fire that precisely, that long." But they were men, exhausted, deafened, trapped in rotating coffins, yet holding their line mile after mile. Miller felt an unexpected sense of respect. That night, as he wrote his report to Berlin, he could hear Allied bombers droning in the far distance, the deep hum of engines echoing across the airfield like a distant heartbeat. He thought of the men inside those flying fortresses, each sealed within his own turret, each trusting the machinery and the noise to keep him alive. He wrote, "We tried to outfly them. We must now outthink them." The B-24's guns are not merely defensive. They represent a doctrine of total protection. To defeat such machines, we would have to change our idea of air war itself. But by 1944, it was too late. The Allied formations grew larger, the escort stronger, and the sky above Germany turned into a deadly ocean of contrails and smoke. When Rechlin was finally captured in 1945, Allied intelligence officers found the remains of the dissected B-24 turret still in the corner of a hangar. The notes from Miller's team scattered across the floor. One officer reportedly laughed in disbelief. "They took it apart just to find out what we already knew," he said. That sometimes too many guns is exactly enough. Miller's notebook, recovered years later, ended with a final line written in faded ink. No plane should have that many guns. And yet that is why they win.